I have for our October issue in the Women in Shared Mobility, I have Cathy Macharis joining us from Europe. And maybe before we get into kind of the questions, maybe give us a bit of background on who you are and why you joined this series.
Yeah, thank you. So my name is indeed Cathy Macharis. I'm working at the Free University of Brussels, and I'm leading the research group MOBI. It's a very interdisciplinary group, so with engineers, economists, geographers, working on urban mobility, sustainable logistics, electric and autonomous vehicles, and batteries. So we are with 120 researchers at the moment, and we really want to help, in fact, society, companies also, governments, to support that transition towards more sustainable mobility and logistics.
And we had a quick conversation before. One of the focus, it seems to me, of your institute is looking at this in a bit more holistic fashion, and looking at what the impact is of transportation on our world, and maybe also on our environment. Maybe you can speak a bit more to that.
Yeah, absolutely. We indeed, if there are like new concepts, we always do this kind of impact assessments to see what will be the impact of these new concepts in terms of sustainability, but also sustainability in the broad sense, looking at social, environmental, and economic aspects. And we also developed a methodology where we aim to include all the different stakeholders, because what we see in this kind of transitions, you all have the different stakeholders, and it's really important to see what are these people's goals, how important is that for them, and how they will feel the impact of new technologies, of new ways of mobility, of new concepts. And so by really having them in the core of our impact assessment, we bring them along in this transition management. So we really get a view of what is important. Are they really in favor of this change, or do they see disadvantages? And if there are disadvantages, what can we do about it? So indeed, that's really something we are really interested in, on what will be the impact and how can we support that transition.
Transportation has quite an impact on most of our lives, like whether it's, you're being stuck in congestion or in traffic in the morning, whether it's air pollution. So we kind of already have an idea of what the impact is of transportation. And do you have any, numbers that would be really key for our listeners or viewers to know? On personal, I think we're focused mostly on personal transportation, but on this personal transportation topic.
Yeah, so indeed, on a personal level, you already feel a lot of impact. And so congestion, you could say, well, in the end, you are deciding for yourself to be in that congestion. So in the sense, you are adding to the congestion of others, but you are also having the effect of it on your own. But then for like local emissions, well, even if you are not in your car, you will have that effect on your health from local emissions. And what we see in Europe, for example, is that there are 500,000 premature deaths due to local emissions. So it's really an enormous effect on the health of people, and it means also more medical costs. And what we often do is add this kind of economic cost to show also to the government, well, it's indeed, these are effects, but they also bring a cost to the society. We call them external costs because they are not included in the transport price. But as a society as a whole, we are indeed paying for this. And so one of our latest studies showed that having freight transport in Brussels, for example, and of course it's part of economic life, but having these trucks and vans in Brussels, it comes at a cost of 50,000 euros a day. 50,000 euros a day, which is quite a lot. You can do a lot with this money.
Mm-hmm.
And this is the kind of calculations we do also to show, well, indeed, as a society, if we don't do anything about these costs, well, we are indeed paying for that. Congestion, for example, it's 1% of European GDP. It's a loss. So it's not only a story about, yes, we want to have more livability in our cities, but it's also about how to come to a society which is not putting money where, yeah, we can do something about. And then there is, of course, the whole thing about climate change, which might not, for many people, already have that feeling of it's there. While I think many of us are getting more and more aware of these effects. In Europe, we had 2 heat waves this summer. Well, it's coming very close by. It's not anymore on average 1 heat wave in every 3 years. No, we will have this minimum 1 a year. There are other effects that we already see in the way we are living due to climate change. And so it's not anymore something abstract, something far away. And I think it's also very important to get aware of, okay, what is this effect and how can we really do something about it? And what you see is that the transport sector is responsible for 32% of all the CO2 emissions. 32%, which is enormous, and which what is even more important to say is that it's not declining, whereas industry, energy sector, they all started and being able to reduce their emissions. The transport sector is still increasing. So I think we really have to do something there. We have to reduce it with a factor 8, which is enormous. And if you look at the climate goals, we really have to reduce it. But there are, of course, some trends behind this increase, which is globalization. A lot of our goods are coming from far away. There is population growth. There is still that increase in demand, which even if we have technological advances, it's still adding up to the CO2 emissions. So I think what we really have to do is coming to a complete transition, a transformation of the way we are traveling, the way we are transporting our goods also, and to go to climate neutral cities, but in the end also a complete climate neutral society.
You mentioned something that, like, I was like, interesting. You talked about industry has shifted. And I always find in a shared mobility context, when you have a fleet operator who owns their asset, I always find from a city perspective, it's a lot easier to move these levers rather than on the individual level. So if we talk about shifting this behavior, which if we have to change it by the transportation by 8 times of what we're doing today, that's a lot. So what do we have to do to make that gigantic leap? Really?
Absolutely. Yeah, and you're right that you have to have the right policy framework. But the way we have to go about more sustainable mobility, I always talk about the 4 A's, which is, first of all, create more awareness. And we talked already a little bit about it. So create more awareness, also what it costs to society. Also have life cycle analysis to really show what is the impact. But also creating more awareness for people like, okay, how are we traveling? What is it meaning in terms of the climate? And then once you are aware, you can do something about it. And the best thing to have less emissions and less trouble is avoidance. And avoidance, well, you might say, yeah, but we still have to travel. Well, sometimes you don't have to travel. Sometimes it's possible to have a Skype meeting, or as like we are talking now, you don't have to always be there. You can also, more and more companies in Europe, they are also offering the possibility to telework, to just work at home. And then there is the whole thing about spatial planning. If you're living closer to where you are working, and if there is also shopping possibilities, sport facilities, so really multifunctional um, developments in compact cities, that's where we have to go. But I'm aware that it will take time, and it's really the core of why and how we are traveling now. That's the spatial planning. Now that's avoidance. And then we really have to go for act and shift. So if we can't avoid it, let's shift it towards the more environmentally friendly modes. And there, shared mobility will have a crucial part in the way we are indeed traveling around, because it can also have a shift towards not ownership, but just the use of different transport modes as we go along, and where we can just see what is necessary at that moment. So I see there for act and shift also, yeah, it's a shift towards walking, biking, and then public transport, but also sharing. If we are using vehicles, let's share them, ride hailing, but also vehicles sharing. And I think it's very important that we have a very close look at it, because it will also be the basis for then concepts like mobility as a service. Will indeed these shared mobility concepts lead to less car ownership? Because I think that's the way we have to go also for our cities, to have also more space in our cities and not have all these cars being parked everywhere. So how will shared mobility help in creating this mobility as a service where you don't need that car ownership anymore? And we get this kind of data from the Brussels government to look at, yeah, how is shared cars, for example, how is that evolving? And we see also that it indeed attracts a new kind of users. The young men population are really interested in this free floating car sharing, whereas with the stationary based car sharing in Brussels, it's more than the, I wouldn't say old, but just a little bit older women without a car. But you already see there a difference in this new kind of population. They often still have their cars. They just want to add their mobility options. But how will it evolve in time if they see, well, there are so many options, do we still need a car? So that will be very important. And then in the longer run, as I said, there are 4 A's: the awareness, then avoidance, act and shift. And then the 4th one is, if it's still cars, let's anticipate new technologies. And there I think we really have to go towards electric vehicles. But again, if we just would shift towards everything electric vehicles, we're not going to get to that factor 8 reduction of our CO2 emissions. We really have to go towards a system of shared electric vehicles, might be also autonomous. But again, and there we have to see how it will evolve. Are we going towards a system with where everybody has his own autonomous vehicle, or will these vehicles being shared? And will it be also on demand and going towards different users on demand, and also connected with a good public transport system, which should still be the core of our sustainable mobility policy? So it's really this challenge, but you see there are these possibilities. But then indeed, if you want to accelerate this transformation, you have to put the right policy framework to get there. And I see there in some cities, they really go for it. It's very clear. For example, also in Brussels, we will have a diesel ban and a petrol ban. So it really shows like, yes, we are going into that direction, investing in public transport, in bike infrastructure. But you need this kind of policy support, because saying that it will come just by its own, no, I don't believe so. And we don't have that much time to get towards that factor 8 reduction.
I want to pick up on one thing that you mentioned when you said there's a clear shift from ownership to sharing, and it's actually in the Canadian context, it's a sad story of a shared mobility that was successful and got pulled out. I don't know if you heard the news, but Cardigo pulled out of Calgary. Now, Calgary, you might think, is a bit of an odd city in the first place. And that might be true, but 14% of the population relied on Cardigo. Cardigo has been there for 6 years. And they just put a story together with CBC, the Canadian Broadcast Association, on the impact. And one thing that I find really interesting, they interviewed one woman who, they didn't have no car, but they went car light. They decided, okay, we have one car, we have 2 kids that we need to get to wherever, so we have one car, but the second one, we only use car sharing for that. Now that it's no longer there, guess what they did? They bought a car.
Yeah, indeed.
So sorry, this is a long story. What I'm trying to ask is, so you talked about cities being kind of these kingmakers and having influence on policy. Do we have to start maybe seeing shared mobility as a bit different? The risk with, a private operator is that they can always do that. They can be like, doesn't work, we'll leave. And now you have a public service basically gone.
Yeah, I think you're right. We really have to look at what is the longer term effect. There are like stories also about public transport operators not investing anymore in parking spaces because they think, well, we better pay Uber or Lyft for the last mile. But in the end, you get really dependent on these kind of actors. And at a certain moment, if there is going to be a monopoly situation, they might also still be there, but raise their prices very high. So how to still keep an inclusive transport system where there is enough competition to lower the prices. But what I'm see also in Brussels, we have, for example, 6 operators for electric scooters here in the city. They all wanted to be the first, but it's clear that they will not all survive. It's really now the competition fully to stay for the fittest, I would say, because they all want to be the first one where you have your app on your smartphone, because they think also once you have one app, you will not go for the second, third, and so on. So, but it's clear that once it's also integrated in a mobility as a service kind of platform, again, it will be crucial who will be in, who will be out for their survival, but also how will it take form, and will it indeed be an inclusive system where you can rely on. So I think the question there is always of, should we make it completely a public story? On the other hand, you could say, well, let just the private operators play in the city. I think it should be really that combination. I think the public authorities really have to take the lead, but let these private operators fit in the framework they set up, so that it's really completely according to their sustainable mobility policy. But true, still then you are dependent on the survival. But I think if you are looking together on how to make it a sustainable story, also in economic terms, I think it's better to do that in combination, and to really have that cooperation between public and private.
Because you then also have a more reliable network or ecosystem, right? From an end user perspective, which Calgary has very limited public transit, and didn't take the leadership at all in this. And then and I'm just going back on that long piece that you were talking, kind of how it might look like. You also talked about electrification, and Europe is Brussels is doing some great work. We have looked at Madrid in particular, that has the restricted access zone with electric, discounts. Again, I feel like and you might have a different view on that, but I feel like if you do it on a fleet level, on a shared fleet level, you have a lot more leverage to enforce this than if you or I have our own vehicle, right? It's a very different
Absolutely.
approach, regulating, quite frankly, and the carrot and stick approach is a little bit different when you work with businesses. What do you think? Is it a combination of both that will shift us and change this transportation story and our emissions, or should governments really focus on the fleet side of things? Do you have an opinion?
Yeah. I think that transition is going quite slowly, because, for example, in Belgium, we only have 2% of electric vehicles, whereas in Norway, for example, it's 50%. And
Mhm.
it all has to do with the right fiscal framework where you indeed stimulate the purchase of these electric vehicles. Now, for Brussels, the city, it will change because of their diesel ban and petrol ban.
Mhm.
But so that kind of fiscal framework is more for the individual level. But you're right, if we go towards more shared mobility, we should have the advancement for having these shared mobility fleets much more stimulated. And one of the campaigns which I really liked here in Flanders, so the northern part of Belgium, is it was a campaign where a lot of people, they got an electric vehicle which they would share with other people, and thanks to that they got also personal advice on how to use it. So it was also very engaging of because I think also that a lot of people are afraid of this kind of changes, and
Mhm.
will I be able to charge it, and can I drive with it, is it not different? Well, if you have such a person who can explain you, like, okay, this is an electric car and I share this with you, it's really a way to further stimulate the adoption of electric vehicles, and then also to show we can do this in a shared way. So I really like that campaign. And in general, I think if you are looking at the change, we already talked about, yeah, what should the government do, and it's about the right framework. I think on an individual level, what I see in terms of change, I really like the story of the elephant. If you want to change an elephant going on a new path, well, you have to talk to the rider of that elephant, say why should we go to that new path, and all about, yeah, the knowledge, oh, for climate, for local emissions, for congestion, and we should go there. That's the rider. But there is also that elephant, and that elephant are all our emotions. Will I be able to change? Can I find my way with public transport? Can I find my way with shared mobility and so on? Well, these are the things we also have to be careful about this emotion. Also see that information and guidance is there, and that you also reward people for making that change. And
Mhm.
so, and then the third aspect of changing behavior is making that new path much easier than what we do now.
Mhm.
So if we talk about shared mobility and electric vehicles, it's really about making that option easier, just much easier than having your own car, which you can't maybe, well, it's going to be more expensive and so on. The same goes with flying. Nowadays, if you want to fly, it's just so cheap, much cheaper than going by train. It's not correct to have this unsustainable behavior as so much easier. So what I really propose is to indeed see that people know why they have to do it, but also take care of their emotion, and then make it just much more easy to go for these new, more sustainable mobility
Mhm.
concepts.
Mhm.
And I think, yeah, the government can do there a lot, but as a community, I think we can help each other to enable that change and to care about the questions that people still might be having about that change.
Mm-hmm. I have one last question tying into kind of the demographic that you mentioned on the free floating side, and quite frankly, even on the scooter side and the Uber side, it seems like the young male, well educated, have a bit more income, no kids yet, they really go for that. So how can we use that group to kind of I don't know, spread the word, tell their friends, or the other segments of the population that hasn't started yet? How can we use those early adopters, young men, to kind of show what's possible? Because they're, you know, you mentioned this in the context of climate change and vehicle ownership, and I'm like, it wouldn't be the first group that most people think of, you know, when you talk about that. So how can we harness them to spread the word to the rest? What can we do?
Yeah, absolute good question. I think these are the early adopters. And in fact, they show a complete culture shift. Whereas before it was having a car, it's status, it's more sexy to have a car. Where now what you see is that indeed these people who are shifting, who are taking the bike, who are working from home, these are more, they are much more appealing than just a guy with a car.
Right.
So indeed, I think we have to show this kind of culture shift and shift in lifestyles as something that is more attractive to all of us.
Mm-hmm.
And they can indeed be an example. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, they become our influencers or ambassadors or whatever.
Yeah, absolutely. When I give presentations, I also show these young guys as well. They are indeed the new kind of lifestyle. And I think it's important because often if we talk about climate, people are like, oh, we have to reduce everything and it's going to be worse, the quality of our life. No, I don't think so. It just, these are the kind of people indeed who are adopting a new way of mobility, which is still according to their needs.
Mm-hmm.
But the need is not anymore to drive all the time with a car. It's just the need for accessibility of doing the things they want to do, but they will just do that in a different way, and showing that you are still can do everything you want, but just in a different way, and even more interesting in terms of your lifestyle, because you will not be having a car that is there parked all the time, but you can have much more flexibility, and that's the new freedom. And before it was my car, my freedom, but it will be my mobility as a service, my freedom
Package. Yeah.
yeah
Yeah. Yeah. All right. I don't have any more questions. Is there anything else you would like to say before we kind of close this that you want to pass on to anybody who sees this?
Well, I just want to thank you for this opportunity, and I really want to stress that climate is not waiting for us. We really have to do something, and it's really very, very urgent.